It is my great pleasure to introduce Brian Cassidy and J.C. Cloutier on this session on the beats. Brian Cassidy has been involved in the book business in one form or another since 1994. In 2004, he established Brian Cassidy Bookseller, specializing in modern and contemporary literature, the beats, poetry, popular culture, esoterica, artist books, and the avant-garde, small journals and magazines, especially those associated with the Mimeo Revolution, letters, manuscripts, and archives, as well as the vernacular, folk, and outsider books. He is on the faculty of the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar and is currently developing a course to debut summer 2020 for Rare Book School entitled Understanding and Identifying the 20th Century Duplicating Technologies, a subject on which he has lectured at the University of Virginia, New York University, Yale, Columbia, and elsewhere. He is a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers. And J.C. Cloutier is the assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD from Columbia University, where he also archived the papers of Samuel Roth, Erica Jong, and Barney Rossett. He is the co-editor of Claude McKay's Amiable with Big Teeth, Penguin Classics 2017, the editor of the original French writings of Jack Kerouac, La Vie et Dommage, Boreal 2016, and he also translated Kerouac's French novellas in the Library of America volume, The Unknown Kerouac, Rare, Unpublished, and Newly Translated Writings. His book, Shadow Archives, The Life Cycles of African American Literature, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press. Please join with me in welcoming Brian Cassidy to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you to David for inviting me. Hadn't really occurred to me until just this moment that I'd be speaking about Allen Ginsberg in front of Anne Waldman, which is suddenly feeling very intimidating. Nevertheless. But it is nice to see so many friendly faces that I know. As a bookseller, I feel a little bit like I'm invading here. But again, I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk about the Gotham Howl. Or as it says there, the Gotham Howls. On December 6, 2013, Christie's auction house offered what was purported to be one of the great rarities of 20th century poetry, the true first edition of Allen Ginsberg's Howl, spirit duplicated or dittoed, not mimeographed as it is often described, in an edition of only about 25 copies, months before the publication of the better-known City Lights edition. The work had come to auction just twice before, once in the 1977 Jonathan Goodwin sale at Sotheby's Park Bernay, and at Bonhams only the previous year in April of 2012. The Christie's copy, however, was particularly noteworthy not just because it was inscribed by Ginsberg, but because it also included other lengthy inscriptions by Michael McClure, David Meltzer, Martha Rexroth, who ran off the copies on the Ditto machine at San Francisco State, where she worked as a secretary, and was additionally signed by Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen. All of these people were either involved in the publication of Howl or participated in the legendary 1955 Six Gallery reading where Howl debuted. As the Christie's catalog description touted, very rare, only 2 copies of the mimeographed Howl have appeared at auction, and certainly none with the superb inscriptions of the present. The auction realized $118,750, beating the high estimate by almost $30,000. It was not only the highest price paid for a Ginsberg at auction, but also, so far as I've been able to ascertain, the highest price paid at auction for any published work of 20th century American poetry. Really? There was just one problem. It was not the true first edition published in 1956. It was also certainly not even the second known, the second known Gotham edition that I'm going to talk about this afternoon. It was, in fact, from a previously undocumented, likely third impression. This is my copy of that impression, unsigned. The story of these impressions and their distinguishing bibliographic elements are what I would like to speak to you about today. For more than a year, as part of a larger project involving the history and bibliography of the first edition of Howl, as well as my ongoing research into understanding and identifying 20th century duplicating technologies, which, as mentioned before, I'm developing a class for summer 2020 at Rare Book School on. I've been researching the Gotham editions among the papers of Andreas Brown and the Gotham Book Mart at the Ransom, Columbia, and here at Penn, as well as among relevant materials at the Ginsberg Archive at Stanford. So what I'm about to present is based on this original research, and I'd just like to thank a couple people real quick, Kate Midas and Travis Kent, who were sort of my hands on the ground in a couple instances, Leslie Morris at Harvard, Rebecca Wingfield at the Ginsberg Archive at Stanford, and David McKnight here at Penn. After the 1956 Ditto edition, Ginsberg retained the masters, and sometime after 1969 or so, when the Gotham Book Mart began appraising Ginsberg's papers, these same original masters were used to produce an entirely new printing. This so-called Gotham edition, however, is surrounded by legend, misinformation, and confusion. A 2012 Bonhams auction, in fact, the same auction that the previously mentioned first edition was auctioned at, described this edition as quote-unquote mysterious. And the only real account of its creation comes from Bill Morgan's standard 1994 bibliography of Ginsberg. Quote, "This was intended to be a facsimile edition. It was printed by Gotham Book Mart from the original Ditto masters used for the first printing, which had been saved by Allen Ginsberg. About 100 copies were printed," end quote. Morgan dates the edition to 1979 and describes it as, quote, "unauthorized." But the truth of its creation is both more complicated and interesting. What we know is this. By early 1969, Ginsberg was looking for some place to store and maintain his growing archive. Ginsberg always kept an eye on his literary legacy and saved, if not everything, as close to everything as he could. Among the more infamous items among his papers, for example, are his beard clippings and his sneakers. He realized, however, that the archive was no longer safe, either from the possibility of fire, flood, nor the parade of potential pilferers that passed through his door, and he began to search for possible institutions who could safely maintain the collection and make it accessible to scholars. The University of Kansas expressed an early interest, but Ginsberg was concerned about its isolation and his own ability to make use of the collection. A New York City location made much more sense, and given his connection to Columbia from his undergraduate days, that appealed to the poet. Ginsberg had an existing relationship with Andreas Brown, and Brown had already become known for handling the papers and archives of many writers in and around New York City when Ginsberg contacted him around this time to ask if Brown would be willing to inspect the facilities at Columbia and discuss the potential arrangement with head librarian Ken Loaf. Brown did so, reported back favorably, and by March of 1969, boxes began arriving at Columbia for processing for what was understood to be a long-term loan of at least 10 years, with the right of first refusal when Ginsberg decided to sell. In order to protect Ginsberg, Brown began conducting a loose inventory, this is an example of the first of those loose inventories, of the materials before they made their way to Columbia, additionally providing both Columbia and Ginsberg with a rough appraised value of each deposit in the event of loss, damage, or dispute. This arrangement between Ginsberg and Brown appears to have begun without any formal financial understanding between the two. Brown perhaps viewed the arrangement as beneficial to his reputation and that it would likely present other more remunerative opportunities down the road, but he also seems to have quickly understood that this would likely be a much larger project than he was expecting, and in a letter dated March 24th, 1969, just after the second deposit of materials, and perhaps just after encountering the Ditto masters themselves among the papers, Brown suggests, quote, "I would like also to make some Mimeo copies of that early version of Howl. Perhaps we could make a limited number, say 50, number and sign them indicating that they are reruns from the original Mimeos. They could then be sold to the many institutions who do not have this important item and would be grateful. In this way, you could pay me for the labor of getting the archive deposited and with no real cost to you. I would, of course, agree to sell the Howl Mimeo at whatever price you thought fair. The Mimeo masters have been sent to Columbia Library, but I could arrange with your permission to get them from Ken Loaf to make the reruns. It's all up to you." Ginsberg, however, in a letter dated April 9th, 1969, was initially resistant, albeit somewhat contradictorily so. Quote, "I hesitate to set loose a flood of purely bibliographically professionally inspired Howl Ditto reruns. I've accumulated enough scribbled papers without superimposing more, and it tends to diminish the charm of NAIF originals. I would really rather pay you for the labor of getting the archive examined and deposited, assuming I have enough cash. Can you send me a bill, and also in case I'm broke or misjudging context, what you think the reruns would cost to make and what they are worth if sold, end quote. I've been unable to locate Brown's reply to this letter, but just 10 days later, in an April 19th letter to Brown, Ginsberg seems to have come around to the idea. Okay, the Howl mimeo sounds, and then this next word is a little ineligible, but I think it's ingenious. Ginsberg, okay, the Howl mimeo sounds ingenious, and as I do feel obligated to you, this is a good way to unwrinkle that. For reasons that are unclear, Brown then waits more than 2 months to request the return of the Ditto Masters from Columbia, but citing the April 19th letter from Ginsberg as authority, he does so on June 26, 1969, promising to return the Masters within 3 days of receipt. Loaf's response has likewise apparently perished. I wasn't able to find it, but the Masters were at some point returned to Brown, who ran off about 100 copies. A copy annotated by Brown here at among the Gotham papers at Penn, and I understand on display, David? Yeah, and on display, dates the printing to 1969. Ginsberg and Brown, however, sometime between this printing and the end of the year, Ginsberg and Brown appear to have reached a different arrangement that apparently involved, at least in part, Brown not selling this recently reprinted Howl for compensation for his work, but instead one of Ginsberg's duplicate copies of the original 1956 printing, already a collector's item very much in demand. The evidence for this arrangement is a little complicated, so bear with me here. The first is that the new edition, which was to have been signed, numbered, and with a preface or introduction from Ginsberg, as this unused draft colophon among the Gotham papers here shows, was apparently never completed nor offered for sale. Additionally, a copy of the original Ditto, the 1956 edition, sold by Serendipity Books in 1974, carried the following description, quote, "The copy on hand is Ginsberg's second, given to Gotham Book Mart in partial payment for appraisal, and eventually sold to England where we purchased it." This copy can be traced still further back to a private offer of Ginsberg material from Andreas Brown to collector Richard Aaron, later of Amhere Books, in September of 1970. And while there is a possible gap in the chain of possession between 1970 and 1974, in other words, between this offering by Brown to Richard Aaron and its subsequent reappearance by Serendipity Books in 1974, Brown took note of the Serendipity sale in 1974, cutting out and filing a newspaper clipping covering the offering, which suggests that these were indeed the same copy. In addition, an October 1969 inventory of the Gotham Book Mart lists among the items in the Gotham's safe Ginsberg, quote, Ginsberg material, Howl, etc., and assigns it a value of $750. This would suggest that the new Gotham printing was executed sometime between July, after the Masters were requested from Columbia, and October of 1969, by which time it appears some new arrangement had been reached that would account for the apparent presence of the Howl Ditto among the stock of the Gotham safe. But we can likely be even a bit more specific, as Brown was seemingly still seeking information about the new printing of the Ditto as late as August of '69, when Robert Creeley wrote this postcard, this is also here at Penn, to the Gotham owner, clearly in response to questions from Brown, who was presumably still gathering information for this new impression. Creeley offers his recollections about the Ditto edition. Creeley had in fact typed the Masters, and suggested talking to Martha Rexroth, quote, "Check with her perhaps, I don't know her present married name, but anyhow she might remember," end quote. And indeed, among the Gotham papers at the ransom is a note in Brown's hand recording Martha's new married name and noting, this is on the verso of this, quote, "The former Martha Rexroth name given to me by A. Ginsberg in re Howl mimeo." These are filed roughly among other August 1969 papers. So, the Gotham printing was created most likely in July or possibly August of 1969, but almost certainly no later than October, and definitely not in 1979, as Morgan attributes. I've wondered if perhaps that might have been a typo, in fact. Further, it appears that the edition was not unauthorized, as Morgan describes it, so much as it was never realized. And while it might be tempting to attribute the change to a potential misunderstanding between Ginsberg and Brown, or even to something more nefarious, a 1974 postcard from the poet to the Gotham owner shows that Ginsberg had not forgotten even 5 years later about the project. Throughout the 1970s, Brown continued to appraise and inventory regular deposits from Ginsberg to Columbia, and on June 18, 1974, Ginsberg wrote, after just such another placement, quote, "Received latest inventory, should you not take a percentage of the whole deal, or subtract payment in kind value, or barter on some as before, or the Howl Mimeo edition, question mark." But, and sadly, between this postcard and the mid-1980s, all of these details and arrangements seem to have been forgotten by the parties involved. Brown never did return the Ditto Masters to Columbia. And and a curious side note here, the masters were not found among Ginsberg's archive until I inquired about their whereabouts. If you want to see an amazing finding aid, look at the Ginsberg finding aid. It's like 1,000 pages long, I'm not kidding. It's astounding. And I went through it with a fine-toothed comb a number of times and couldn't find the masters on the finding aid and inquired, and they said, "Gee, that's interesting. We don't know where they are." And they had to go and actually locate them. And now they've actually scanned them and put them online. You'll see an example of one in a minute. Brown never did return the Ditto Masters to Columbia, and in a 1986 letter to Ginsberg from Brown, apparently in response to an unlocated but presumably very concerned request from the poet about the whereabouts of the masters, Brown wrote, quote, "After considerable searching of our storage rooms, we did find the early Mimeo Howl masters and a box of copies which had been made from the masters. I do not remember the details, and it appears that none were sold. I am returning to you the master Mimeos and a few copies of the reprint we made. Shall we destroy the remaining copies, about 100? If not, I feel strongly that they should be imprinted in some way, the Gotham Book Mart rubber stamp, question mark. It would be too easy to confuse them with the original, which now sells for a great deal of money." In 1986, this probably would have sold for probably somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000. Now sell a great deal of money. "I can assure you that I have not sold any of these since they were made." And then this is quoted at length in Bill Morgan's bibliography, and then Morgan then goes on. So this is Morgan, quote, "No one is quite sure what happened to them after that point, but they are presumed to have been destroyed." Now, I can tell you that I've always read this account with a certain sympathy for Ginsberg and an equal skepticism toward Brown. Morgan's description of this printing as unauthorized, the quote-unquote discovery of the masters almost 20 years later and only when asked, the faint whiff of opportunism and potential for subterfuge all suggested to me, as it seems it did to Morgan, and perhaps even Ginsberg, who would later allude to, quote, various misunderstandings between himself and Gotham, that Brown, who throughout his career was involved in all sorts of disputes and lawsuits involving or alleging financial mismanagement, had perhaps cut some corners and taken some liberties in the creation of the Gotham Howl. And I can tell you as a bookseller, in conversation with colleagues, I have heard rumors of Gotham printings sold despite assurances of destruction, of unstamped Gothams offered as true firsts. But I can find no evidence that Brown was not being honest when he said that none were sold, and that the vast majority of the copies were destroyed in 1986. For one, none of the known true first editions extant are misidentified 1996 Gothams. I have examined all of them. And I can also say that there are no ghosts. All 11 known copies have a full provenance, and there are no provenances without a corresponding copy. We know copies that are perished, but there's no gaps in any of the ownership. So I have strong reason to believe that the 11 known copies are it. I think it's unlikely that another copy is going to come up. Further, with the exception of a single offering in that same list, which Brown offered collector Richard Aaron, the true first edition in 1970, so if we go back real quick to here, if you look at, I believe it's number 3, I can't read it as well as you can. Sorry, number 2, facsimile reissue of the above with explanatory note of its history, $4.50. With the exception of that, I find no evidence that Brown ever sold any of these new Gotham printings, and even the one that he offered to Aaron was not finalized, because when Aaron tried to buy it, Brown responded saying, quote, "It is not yet ready for publication," end quote. Which again further suggests to me that Ginsberg and Brown saw this as some sort of longer-term project, with the true first 1956 printing being the more immediate compensation for Brown's work. And with the exception of the single unstamped copy among the Gotham papers here at Brown that's on display, I have not found a single unstamped example of the 1969 Gotham. In addition, I've located just 5 distinct copies, either in private or institutional hands, with the stamp. And among those, at least 3 of those known surviving copies, and possibly all of them, originate with the copies that Brown sent to Ginsberg, suggesting that the vast majority of copies did indeed remain uncirculated and were in all likelihood destroyed. Indeed, in the strictest sense, the Gotham printing, I should say, appears paradoxically rarer than the first edition, despite a print run some 4 times larger. But as Brown suggested to Ginsberg, quote, "It would be too easy to confuse them with the original, which now sells for a great deal of money," end quote. And indeed, as this slide shows, it is quite difficult to tell them apart. And unfortunately, the bibliographical work on these 2 printings has up until now been incomplete. Morgan suggests that, quote, "The only difference between the original and the facsimile is the color of the ditto ink used," end quote. But there are several problems with that statement. The first being that in the strictly speaking, this issue is not in any sense a facsimile. While I've heard the Gotham Howl referred to variously as a facsimile, a piracy, a second edition, or a reproduction, bibliographically, it is in fact a second impression, having been struck from the original setting of type, in this case, the original masters. And while Morgan describes different ditto inks, this too is incorrect. The ink, such as it is, and it's really closer to a dye, is not a separate element as in most printing. It's not added to the machine as in a mimeograph, but rather is part of the master itself, which a solvent, the spirit in spirit duplication, subsequently dissolves slightly so that the image can be transferred onto the clean sheet of paper passing under it. So Morgan suggesting that one way to distinguish the two is the color of the ditto ink is incorrect, because in fact it is the very same ink. Further, given that alanine processes, that's the general term for spirit duplication, the chemical process here is based on an aniline dye. Those processes, such as ditto, are light sensitive, indeed sensitive to a number of environmental factors, and so their appearance is heavily dependent on the conditions in which they are kept. And my research suggests that color is not a reliable method of telling one howl from the other. So what are the reliable methods of differentiating the two? The answer to this largely lies, again, in understanding the method of printing, the ditto. Let's begin with the one bibliographic element that Morgan identifies correctly. He states, quote, "All the pages in the facsimile edition are perfectly aligned on the page, while many in the original seem to have been printed at an angle and are off-center," end quote. And this is true. As you can see in this slide, page 9, and this is the most extreme example, page 9 in the original 1956 printing on the left is at an obvious angle. This is not, however, due to an error in the creation of the master. Here, for example, is the master for that page on the left from Stanford. And as you can see, it is aligned properly. What this means is that when the master was mounted on the drum of the machine, it was accidentally mounted on an angle. The machine is built to some extent to accommodate operator error of this kind, the drum being wider than the master by some margin on most machines. So the angle is not on many copies of the original, but rather on all copies of the original, and identically so. All page 9s of the original edition are printed on the same angle, and less obvious angles are measurable on several other pages as well. And these angles are consistent across the printing. These angles do not appear on the Gotham edition and are therefore a useful initial determinant of the true first printing. An additional and perhaps even easier bibliographical point appears, however, on the title page. On the left, you see a detail in the 1956 printing of Howl, and I want to draw your attention to the terminal O in Carl Solomon. Take note that the O has both an inner and an outer circle. This is not a random event. This is, in fact, a typical effect often seen in spirit duplicating, caused by the die and the waxy medium in which it is suspended being displaced away from the typewriter key during impact. This hollowed out pattern is a defining characteristic of many letter forms in spirit duplication. But this telltale inner O is absent on the Gotham printing, something Brown himself noted on the copy that I mentioned before at Penn. Is that my next slide? Yes, it is. You can see that he identifies that as the one of the identifying factors. This is almost certainly not a random printing error. Spirit masters are typically only good for perhaps a few hundred copies before being exhausted. The spirit fluid, remember, dissolves a bit of the waxy text with each pass. A process we are likely seeing here already begun with these two O's. All copies I've examined exhibit this particularity, including the final and previously unrecorded printing I am going to discuss now. There we go. The Serendipity Printing. Sometime around 1995, Peter Howard, seen here in his native habitat, of Serendipity Books in Berkeley, acquired at least 4 complete copies and at least 1 incomplete of what he thought was the original known Gotham printing just discussed. These, though, were unstamped and unstapled, and Howard, being the enterprising dealer that he was, and let me apologize for all dealers here, decided to create a sort of new issue, and here I am using the term in its true bibliographical sense, by having it signed or inscribed by those involved either in its printing, such as Martha Rexroth, or those who participated in the 6 gallery reading, like Michael McClure and Philip LaMancha. Is this beginning to sound familiar? And over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, he traveled around the country, gathering signatures and inscriptions and compensating participants with trades from stock, donations to favorite charities, or outright cash payments. Ginsberg himself agreed to participate only if he received a finished copy, and it is now among his papers at Stanford, ironically, and again sadly, the only version of the Howl ditto they have in that archive. Ginsberg originally started with 2 copies. One he gave to Brown for compensation, and the other disappeared, according to a curator's notes at Stanford sometime in the 80s. The origins of these unstapled Gotham copies is somewhat in dispute. My colleague John Crichton of the Brick Row Bookshop, who worked for Peter during this time, identifies the source as the University of New Mexico, to whom Andreas Brown sold hundreds of thousands of Gotham duplicates in overstock in one of the largest deals of its kind in the mid-1970s. And while it might make some sense that some copies of the Gotham edition might have made their way to New Mexico during this enormous transaction, the UNM origins of these particular copies is undercut by 2 significant details. First is that New Mexico does not appear to have retained a copy for themselves, something one would imagine they almost surely would have done, when you consider that in John's account, Peter acquired them as a result of the university's deaccessioning of duplicates. Further, among the last copies of this Serendipity issue Howard sold was the one that's currently residing at Harvard. And among the documentation retained with that copy is this letter from Peter Howard, in which he attributes the provenance to the estate of longtime Gotham Book Mart rare book manager Matthew Monahan. This more contemporaneous and direct source, coupled with the lack of a copy at UNM, as well as Monahan's death in late 1994, which aligns with the timeline of events, leads me to believe that this is more likely the correct source of these copies. But whatever the source, Howard slowly sold these elaborately inscribed copies off between 1996 and 2004. This is his last copy for sale in his 2004 catalog. This is the copy now at Harvard. All described as being, quote, second mimeographed edition, first state without Gotham Book Mart stamp. What Howard did not know, however, was that the copies he had acquired were from yet another, likely later, but entirely separate printing. The first piece of evidence for this printing is that all of the Serendipity copies are on watermarked paper. As you can see here on the Harvard copy, it's printed on Ditto Duo Run brand paper. All of the Serendipity copies I have examined are on this paper, including my own. None of the 1969 Gothams are printed on this paper, nor are any of the 1956 Dittos. However, as a new ream of different, I'm going to read a couple sentences and then I'm going to take them away. However, as a new ream of different stock could certainly have been used during the printing of the 1969 version, this is not definitive evidence of a new and separate printing. As I was driving up here, I actually am not sure that I believe that sentence anymore. If all of the Serendipity copies are on a particular kind of paper and none of the other ones are, the way that you compile a document like this wouldn't allow for that. It would almost be like in a multi-deck of cards dealing 12 aces in a row. Because you're printing each page individually. It's not like a Xerox machine with where you can sort of put everything in and it runs it through. You're printing 100 copies of one page, then 100 copies of another page, then 100 copies of yet a third page and compiling them. So I'm revising this today. And indeed, on first glance, both the generally straight orientation of the text and the hollow O's noted in the Gotham printing are here present as well. But what proves even more that this is a separate printing from the Gotham is the horizontal placement of the text on each page. And again, understanding the operation, oh, I'm sorry, there's another image of the watermark. And again, understanding the operation of the Ditto machine here is key. Much like in your home printer, this incidentally is my Ditto machine, Ditto machines have paper hoppers, guides, and various wheels that position the stock consistently relative to the drum and pull it through the machine when cranked. And just like your home printer, while occasional sheets might misfeed early or late, resulting in print either too high or too low on the page, i.e. variation on the vertical axis, variation on the left-right axis or the horizontal axis generally should not vary, or should vary only by very small margins over most or all of a given run. Therefore, significant variance on these horizontal measurements vis-a-vis other copies is strong evidence of a separate printing, with confidence increasing with every copy examined. And such differences across multiple pages and copies is, in my opinion, essentially conclusive. Significant and consistent variation is almost always going to indicate a separate run. And in fact, we see these variances in the Serendipity copies when compared to Gotham's, and Gotham's to the true first edition. I won't bore you with the exact measurements, nor go page by page through the various editions, but as you can see on the image behind me here, the Howl on the title page of the 4 1956 editions on top all align within a very narrow range with less than a millimeter of variance between them. When we compare this, however, with the misidentified Serendipity copy from the 2013 Christie's auction, the difference becomes plain. As you can see, it is off by a full letter width. And these next two slides, which I'm going to toggle between, compare the 1969 Gotham, this first slide, with my own unsigned copy of the Serendipity. And you can see that red line does not move. These are scaled to be exactly the same. And you can see that they move. Don't pay no attention to the up and down. Pay attention to the left and right. And the differences between the three printings themselves become even more pronounced when we look at the dedication of the three printings side by side. So the 1956 on the top, 1969 on in the middle, and the Serendipity on the bottom. These variances exist on almost every page when compared, and in my opinion cannot be adequately accounted for by anything other than a separate printing involving a remounting of the Ditto master. Coupled with the watermark paper unique to these copies and their particular provenance, for me the evidence of a new and separate printing is nearly certain. Why was this printing created? I have found no evidence that accounts for its existence. Unlike the 1969 printing, this one truly is mysterious. Nevertheless, I think given the more than 16-year window of opportunity between the creation of the 1969 Gotham and the return of the masters to Ginsburg in 1986, it is far more likely that this printing is later than the Gotham. And aside from the uninscribed copy of this printing that I own, and that I curiously bought from Will in the audience here, all the known copies of this likely later printing are the Serendipity issue, which is to say with the signatures and the inscriptions. Which brings us back to the Christie's auction of 2013. By now you've probably gathered that the unusual nature of the inscriptions on the copy Christie's purported to be the original bore a striking similarity to the Serendipity copies, and you would be right. And even in the catalog description itself, Christie's describes the provenance as via Peter Howard to the present owner. Unfortunately, the image Christie's maintains online of this auction is of insufficient quality to determine if the O in Solomon contains the telltale inner circle or not. But luckily, it is not of insufficient quality to make relative comparisons between it and a properly identified serendipity issue offered just this past June at Christie's. Let me say that again for anyone who missed it. Christie's sold the same thing twice, once in 2013, identified as the true first, and again just this past June, properly attributed. It's not the same exact copy, but it's the same thing. As you can see here, they align perfectly. And here is a comparison to my own copy. Again, note that these all fall within a very narrow range. These are all the same printing, and just for a quick comparison, there it is against the Gotham printing. I'll close by saying that this past June's auction at Christie's, this is the catalog description, of the more or less properly identified serendipity copy carried an estimate of $20,000 to $30,000, and it failed to sell, which means it did not reach its consignor's minimum reserve price, which in most auctions is half the low reserve, or $10,000, which is to say the buyer of the 2013 copy overpaid by at least $100,000. A costly mistake indeed, and one, I'll just note in closing, that continues to have after effects. A colleague of mine is now currently offering a noble fragment of the Serendipity copy, of the Serendipity edition. He's offering 2 pages with the inscriptions only for a lot of money. And I will be sending him this essay when I'm done here. But I don't think there's any malfeasance on his part. I think he's getting his authority from the 2013 Christie's auction. So these things have real-world consequences. I thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it off to my colleague. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be part of this occasion. I've been hearing about the Gotham collection since I arrived here 5-6 years ago. So it's really a great feeling to be part of the symposium and part of this unveiling, finally, of this great acquisition. And it's great that it's finally available for research. In fact, I'm basically forcing all of my students to work in it this semester. So what I'll talk about this afternoon centers around a singular archival document related to Jack Kerouac that was found in the Gotham during the long years of processing its contents. David McKnight, the architect behind the Gotham acquisition, sent me an email this past summer to ask if I'd like to present at the symposium and to tell me about this Kerouac item. And David wrote, "The Gotham had planned to do a facsimile of Kerouac's holograph manuscript of the town and the city. We have the prospectus. Is this something that would be of interest to you?" So I was away on leave at the time, but I immediately replied, yes, this would be of interest to me. The mention of a holograph manuscript draft as opposed to a typescript of the town and the city is intriguing. I've spent a lot of time in the Kerouac archive at the New York Public Library's Berg collection, and this was not an item I had seen. I returned to Philly at the end of the summer, and I finally was able to go by David's office, and he gave me a Xerox copy of the document in question, and that's what it is here. So I want to spend a bit of time describing it, since every bit of information contained on a document became an important aspect of the research process that ensued. It's an advertisement, or rather a prospectus. It's recto verso, printed on both sides. It announces the following: "We are pleased to offer the previously unrecorded first manuscript draft of Jack Kerouac's first book, The Town and the City," parenthesis, here titled The Haunted Life, 72 holograph pages. And then underneath, we learned that also included in the manuscript is a list of characters for future novels, naming over 100 known acquaintances and their locales. When you open the document, so this is like one side if you open it up flat, and then if you open it, you get this, which is the list of characters on the right, and the title page on the left as a kind of teaser, right? A lot of gems here. So on the left, you get the holograph frontispiece or title page in Kerouac's hand. The title of the manuscript is clearly The Haunted Life, the first draft of which we learned was begun in May 19th, 1944 in New Orleans. There's an intended 3-part structure to the full story: Part 1, home; Part 2, war; Part 3, change. Then Kerouac adds 3 epigraphs, one from Milton, one from Marcel Proust, and one from Arthur Rimbaud. Interestingly, even though both Proust and Rimbaud are French authors, Kerouac uses the English translation of the Proust passage, but he gives the original French title, À la recherche du temps perdu, and the Rimbaud he transcribes from the original French, which suggests that when he sat down to write this first draft in New Orleans, he had with him an English copy of Proust's Swann's Way, a book that he was obsessed with, and a French copy of Une Saison en Enfer by Rimbaud. So the aforementioned characters for future novels, you can see it here. It consists of names nestled underneath town or city names that these future characters are associated with for Kerouac. The list does live up to its name. Many, in fact, practically all of the names who appear on this list eventually made their way into Kerouac's literary output. There are the names of real people from Kerouac's life, like Sebastian Sampras, G.J., Scotty, Margaret, Mary Carney, all childhood friends or girlfriends from Lowell, Massachusetts, where he grew up, that appear in novels like Dr. Sachs, Maggie Cassidy, and so on. Also listed are the folks he met when he moved to New York City and with whom he would later become permanently associated, like Allen Ginsberg, Lucian Carr, William Burroughs, and so on. There's also some famous entries that are more influences or themes, like the French writer Céline, right? Please note, though, that underneath Washington, Bob Zimmerman is not a young Bob Dylan. He was only 3 years old at the time. Other entries are more like stock characters, like Chief Engineer, Come On Gambler, Cabins Crowd. Old whore. Didn't want to say that one. All right. All in all, this page is a fascinating window into Kerouac's writing process, a hint of how meticulous he was when it came to long-term planning of his unfolding literary project. In fact, his archive at the Berg confirms this, as it contains so many lists and charts and outlines and maps. This is an example of that, with a year and then the name of character and what that relates to what happens to that character in that given year. There are endless examples of this in the Berg collection. So it's important to note here how records like these kind of fly in the face of much of Kerouac's reception history in the United States, which often dismisses him as someone who has no craft, but is rather interested in Epicurean binges and bouts of unrevised typing, as Truman Capote would have. Okay, so getting back to the Gotham Prospectus here, there's more important morsels of information on the document's first page here. First, as if to mock future scholars, we read further details on request. Yeah, right, if only. But there is another detail lower down the page, namely Gotham's motto or tagline that's given to us both on the cover and on the back page here: over 60 years of the best in literature. So this tagline allows us to make an educated guess as to when this prospectus was made. Gotham Book Mart opens its doors in 1920, plus 60 years would date this document around 1980. So now that date makes it a very interesting, a very intriguing document for reasons I'll explain shortly. So when I get this out of David's office, I'm very excited, and the first step was basically to investigate or solve the chief claim of the announcement, namely that this is the first draft of Kerouac's first novel, The Town and the City. The Town and the City was Kerouac's first novel, published in 1950, and as you can see here, published under the name of John Kerouac. When he first entered the Merchant Marine in 1942, Kerouac had his name changed to John. His birth name is Jean-Louis Kerouac. Because, as he says in Satori in Paris, you can't go around in America or join the Merchant Marine and be called Gene. And that's why people call me JC. Because, all right. So Kerouac changed his name to John, but people, which is the English version of Jean, if you didn't know, and people who knew him in New York, his friends, would call him Jack. The novel is much more conventional than Kerouac's later works. It was written before he devised spontaneous prose, and it's often said to be reminiscent of Thomas Wolfe's work, which is a writer that Kerouac really admired in his early years. The narrative of the novel is bifurcated into, between the town and the city, Galloway, which is a stand-in for Lowell, and New York. Lowell being, Kerouac's birthplace, where he grew up in French-Canadian neighborhoods and cheap wooden tenements. It follows the tribulations of the Martin family, especially the three Martin brothers, Peter, Francis, and Joe Martin. Kerouac seems to he kind of puts a little bit of his personality into all three brothers, but especially Peter, who's a high school athlete who dreams of becoming an artist. So why would the Gotham Prospectus claim that Haunted Life manuscript is a first draft of Town and the City? Well, thankfully, this is 2019, and by now, not only is Kerouac's archive open, but a great many posthumous works by him have been released. And this includes, lo and behold, a slim book called The Haunted Life and Other Writings, published in 2014 and edited by Todd Teachin. The Haunted Life is really an unfinished early manuscript by Kerouac, one of his earliest attempts at writing seriously about his childhood in Lowell. And it's really kind of part one, Home, from that cover page, of the planned three-part novel that was never completed. If you've read the book, you would know immediately why the Gotham Book Mart thought this manuscript was a first draft of Town and the City, because both novels' protagonist is Peter Martin, which is Kerouac's alter ego. But Haunted Life is actually not a genetic past life of Town and the City. It's really its own thing that went nowhere, and was literally nowhere for a long time. And to be more precise, this manuscript has been considered lost to oblivion for decades. And when I say considered lost, I mean that even its author, Kerouac himself, thought it was lost. We know this because of a convenient little document in his archive at the Berg Collection, a page from 1954 that is more or less a bibliography of his major works at the time. So, yeah, here it is. It lists titles of books Kerouac has written thus far, the year in which he wrote them, and his estimation of their approximate total word count. The name he gives to this list, if he can be called a failure who leaves 1.5 million unpublished words at 32, reflects the reality that in 1954, Kerouac had only been able to publish a single novel, namely The Town and the City. It's at the top there, and it's the only one that's marked as published. I've always found this page to be singularly powerful because it sucks you right into the world of the creator at the moment of composition. Here, it pushes the researcher to remember that most of Kerouac's prolific years of writing were spent in total obscurity. The page is a kind of living snapshot of 1954 Kerouac, a privileged window into the author's own knowledge of his extant literary output and his own insecurities at being possibly a writing failure. On the Road, the novel that will make him famous, is 3 years away from this moment, after he makes the list. So in my previous scholarship, I had encountered this page to help track down Kerouac's French manuscripts, because if you look here, he also lists, so the second to last asterisk on the page is he lists Old Bull Balloon, parenthesis, in French, Night is my woman, parenthesis, in French. So it was yet another evidence of that he was listing these as part of his extant literary output for the Douloise legend. And he also writes that they are untyped and untranslated, right there. So I returned to this page after the Gotham Prospectus to look more closely at the list, and you can see at the very bottom, Haunted Life, Lost, parenthesis. I've kind of got a zoom on it there, as well as what looks like cartoons, all lost. A loss indeed. We all want to see his cartoons. There's only a few of his comics in the archive. Mostly these star as a character called Dr. Sax that he would do for Neil Cassidy's Children for fun. Okay, but this 1954 document proves that Kerouac himself was no longer in possession of the manuscript he had called The Haunted Life. It's relevant to point out that in 1944, the year he wrote The Haunted Life, it was quite a momentous year for the 22-year-old Kerouac. His close and most cherished friend, Sebastian Sampis, died in the war at the Battle of Anzio in Italy. Kerouac had also just met Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Lucian Carr, and began tasting New York's bohemian scene. In April 44, he formally quit Columbia University. A month later, he starts the first draft of Haunted Life in May. In August, Kerouac is involved in a very sinister affair. Lucian Carr stabs to death his mentor, David Kammerer, in Riverside Park. Carr explains that he was defending himself from Kammerer's persistent and unwanted sexual advances. Kerouac helps Carr get rid of the murder weapon in Riverside Park, and is charged for being an accessory after the fact. To get out of jail on bail bond, he needed money, and the only solution he found was to get married to his first wife, Edie Parker, whose family was able to pay for the bail. The charges against Kerouac were eventually dropped because the authorities eventually corroborated Carr's story, and he was tried for manslaughter instead of murder, so he didn't go to jail. But it was a stressful, depressing, ecstatic, and dangerous year, 1944. And Kerouac wrote about those events in a number of his novels. Several occasions he went back to it. And somehow, in the midst of all that madness, Kerouac misplaces the Haunted Life manuscript. In his late novel, 1968's Vanity of Douloise, Kerouac quickly mentions Haunted Life as, quote, the long novel I had been writing in pencil and lost in a taxicab. Never heard from it again. And that's it. That was the story as far as anybody knew until 2002. That is when the public heard from it again. On June 18th, 2002, the manuscript of The Haunted Life suddenly resurfaced out of nowhere on auction at Sotheby's in New York, 58 years after its disappearance. Thank you to the Philadelphia Museum of Art for scanning this catalog for me. Okay, so it was listed in the catalog as the longest and most important autographed manuscript by Kerouac ever to appear at auction, and was estimated to go for $100,000 to $150,000. It was further described as an autographed fair copy, meticulously written in Kerouac's hand and absent of marginalia, corrective marks, and significant grammatical errors. Manuscript in very good condition. In the end, the manuscript sold to an unnamed bidder for $95,000. Todd Teachin, in his introduction to the published book, does not identify the seller, but shares what he has been able to find out, namely that the manuscript had apparently been willed to the seller by his longtime domestic partner, who claimed to have discovered it decades earlier in the closet of a Columbia University dorm room. The story was plausible, possible at least, because Kerouac had spent all of October living in Ginsberg, October 1944, living in Ginsberg's dorm room. And then Ginsberg got in trouble for that. Okay. Then Teachin speculates in the introduction that Kerouac had left the manuscript in Ginsberg's room after accepting a berth on the merchant vessel Robert Treat Paine, only to jump ship in Virginia and head back to New York. Why he subsequently lost track of the manuscript, Teachin adds, is impossible to say. So, Teachin's introduction to the published Haunted Life confirmed that this was a lost manuscript, but remained vague on the details as to how it ended up on auction in 2002, which was, as far as we knew at the time, the first public disclosure that the manuscript still existed. In other words, the very existence of the Gotham Haunted Life Prospectus, and the crucial fact that it was done in 1980, thus 22 years before Sotheby's auction, complicates the whole story. So there's like an image of the manuscript, and it's clearly the same one, right, that we have. That's from the prospectus, and that's from the Sotheby's catalog here. So in his introduction, the narrative Teachin tells suggests that it was the sale of the original scroll of On the Road a year earlier in 2001 on auction at Christie's that prompted the unnamed seller to finally test the Haunted Life manuscript's market value. Okay? And there it was in 2001, like a year before. This does make a great deal of sense because the On the Road scroll sold for an unprecedented $2.43 million. To this day, the biggest amount ever paid for a single literary artifact of the 20th century. It was purchased by Jim Irsay, owner of the Indianapolis Colts, if anybody cares. And here's some images of it. Yeah. So, showing up on auction a year later after the sale of the scroll, it makes sense to think that the seller of the Haunted Life manuscript decided to at last reveal that he or she had it after the scroll fetched such a high price. Yet the Gotham prospectus complicates the narrative because it means that this mystery seller had approached the Gotham Book Mart 20 years before in the early 80s when the store was owned by Andreas Brown with the idea of creating a facsimile edition. As we know, the project was never realized, but it means that the manuscript was, for a brief moment in the 80s, in circulation, or that its owner brought it out of the shadows at that time, only to swiftly retreat back into anonymity for another 20 years. So, on the one hand, the Gotham prospectus seems to add even more mystery to an already stupefying provenance, but by adding a 1980 moment to the manuscript timeline between 1944 and 2002, it also opens up kind of new avenues of investigation. So, that said, the missing key was still knowing who sold the manuscript in 2002. and determining whether that was also the same person who had dealt with the Gotham in the 80s. The Sotheby's catalog entry for the manuscript does not name any seller, and the person who purchased it for $95,000 did so by phone and also wished to remain anonymous. So we don't know who sold it, and we don't know who bought it. We only know that the manuscript resurfaced suddenly, right? A transaction took place at Sotheby's, and the manuscript changed hands. That's all we know. So since then, at that point, I kind of exhausted the written record. It was time to resort to new investigative tactics. I reached out to living human beings, to see if memory and oral history might provide additional clues. So I wrote to my friend Todd Teachin, editor of The Haunted Life, because we had worked together on The Unknown Kerouac, so we know each other. And I wrote to Bart Auerbach, the literary appraiser who had written the copy for the Sotheby's catalog in 2002. Now, I met Bart during my research for my book on literary papers, and it was through conversations with him that I learned that he was the guy who had written the copy for that particular catalog, because they don't say the authors on it. So it was just this kind of fortuitous, serendipitous convergence. So even though Bart had handled part of the sale of the manuscript, he did not have a record of the seller. He further explained that unless the seller is named in the catalog, it's virtually impossible to obtain from the auction house. One good piece of news was Bart had noted down the name of the manuscript's buyer on the day of the sale, one Mark Novak. Are you here? No, I know. But Bart had never heard of him. The manuscript sold to Novak via phone at the reserve price of $80,000. That's the hammer price. But the buyer's premium was added, and then it becomes the $95,000 that's listed. Bart further explains via email, I didn't have contact with the consigner of the Haunted Life manuscript. Someone else dealt with the seller. That person left Sotheby's later that year, and I have no idea where she would be now, or if she would even remember the consigner's name, etc. I can ask around, but I'm not hopeful. So this was a lot of good information, but it didn't look good for the prospects of identifying the seller. Bart nevertheless promised he would try to look into it. So I returned to Todd Teachin, and what emerged from my new conversations with Todd, the editor, was that he had never actually had access to the manuscript when he prepared The Haunted Life for publication. He worked exclusively from photocopies, which is a detail I had not realized beforehand. And he said that this was true of the entire book, namely that in The Haunted Life he puts letters and a few other kind of documents in there, working notes. These were all accessed in the form of photocopies that John Sampas, then the literary executor of the Kerouac estate, had made. Okay, I have to pause to talk about John Sampas. Say a few words about him. He passed away in 2017, very recently. John Sampas was Kerouac's nephew by marriage. His third wife, Stella Sampas, was John's sister. When Kerouac died in 1969, Stella Sampas became the owner, so 69, the owner and executor of the Kerouac literary estate and of his meticulously cataloged archive. By all accounts, she was devoted, widow, and she did not try to profit from the archive through posthumous publications, except the only project she believed in was Visions of Cody, which was released in 1972 because Kerouac thought it was his masterpiece, and it is, and it was published. Stella died in 1990, and it was then, 1990, that John took controls of the Kerouac estate. He oversaw a great deal of posthumous publications and sold a lot of Kerouac's personal items in the early 90s. Later, as time went on, he seemed to realize that the archive would have more value if it remained whole. So he stopped selling discrete items and actually purchased back a few things he had sold. In 2001, he struck a deal with the New York Public Library and sold the Kerouac archive, everything except for the scroll, to NYPL, right, which went up for auction. The scroll went up for auction. So, however, before parting with the originals, John Sampas had the entirety of the archive photocopied. And he kept this duplicate doppelganger archive in his house in Grotto, Massachusetts, near Lowell. So getting back to Todd Teachin and his work on The Haunted Life, Todd had not gone to New York, but rather to John Sampas's house and worked on the photocopies. So Todd said that in addition to what was donated to the Berg, Sampas had photocopies of a great number of other Kerouac-related things, and one of these included the Haunted Life manuscript. When I prompted him to tell me how he had obtained the information he gives on the provenance of the manuscript, he cast a bit more doubt on the version of the story he tells in his introduction. He wrote to me, "The material about Ginsberg's dorm room is my speculation, based on what John was willing to tell me about the seller and the manuscript. John said that the seller lived in New York and had the manuscript since the late 40s. My first draft of the introduction didn't speculate on Columbia at all, I just quoted from Sotheby's, but the publisher asked for more, so there it is. At the time, I was reluctant because I only had John's word, and honestly, I wasn't completely convinced that he and the estate wasn't the private seller, though I became more convinced later, unquote. So it did seem strange. If the manuscript had been lost this entire time, how could John Sampas already have a photocopy of it? Of course, this was 2014 when Todd was working on it, so he may have somehow obtained the copy of it from the buyer, Mark Novak, after it had sold at Sotheby's in 2002. Maybe. I did not wait long for some kind of answer. A few weeks after my exchange with Todd, Bart Auerbach came through, and he wrote me back with good news. So his source at Sotheby's had come through. And so he confirmed that Mark Novak was a private collector, and he was the buyer. But the precious information was that the identity of the seller, right? Success regarding the seller of Kerouac, the Haunted Life manuscript. My Sotheby's colleagues writes, the consigner was care of to the law firm administering the Kerouac estate. He can't be more specific. I would assume it means it's the Sampas family, unquote. So this was in a way the only seller that made sense, but it was disappointing to learn of the estate's deception. This meant that the estate had willfully withheld the existence of this manuscript for years, and in doing so had prevented it from being included in the sale and transfer of the Kerouac archive to NYPL in 2001. It seemed to be purely a means for the estate to make more money. It's not surprising that John Sampas would so brazenly lie to Todd when he was working on the manuscript. It's also an interesting lesson in some of the ugliest and unpleasant facets of truth behind the literary marketplace. Anonymity of sellers and buyers can keep the public and scholars in the dark about the existence of artifacts that affect our ability to make informed knowledge about literary history. Market value always trumps research value. That's clear. So still, even learning the identity of the seller as being the estate itself, thereby unscrupulously attempting to profit from the sale, this does not explain where the manuscript was between 1944 and 1980, the year of the Gotham Prospectus. We know that Gotham himself thought it was lost. Okay. There's an unlikely chance that the Sampases, notably Stella Sampas, may have discovered it tucked away somewhere among Kerouac's papers after he died in 1969. But this seems very unlikely because Kerouac took the archiving of his own papers quite seriously. And although Kerouac has a reputation as someone who lived a chaotic life with no order, something say like this, which is a staged photograph, by the way, it was actually more something like this. So let me give you an important example of Kerouac's archival awareness. In 1965, Kerouac's royalties from book sales were at an all-time low. And for the first time in his life, he considered selling a part of his archive. He decided to do a thorough review of its contents and noticed that a holographed 1948 diary was missing. He wrote to a friend, "I'm hoping I drunkenly gave it to Northport Library instead of having it stolen by those teenage bums last week." You can tell the kind of lie the poor man had to leave. So shortly after his drama, Kerouac receives a catalog from the University of Texas, Austin, that includes a photostat of a page from the missing journal that Kerouac recognizes immediately. It turns out that his friend, the poet Gregory Corso, had stolen the notebook in the early 60s and sold it to the House of Books in New York for $1,000 to support his heroin habit. So the store then sold it to the University of Texas. They buy everything. So the point here is that Kerouac keeps really close tabs on what's in there and what's not in there. And he would have known if the Haunted Life was in there. By the way, the catalog from the University of Texas sent to Kerouac, in which a facsimile page from his 1948 journal appears, was from the 1964 exhibition, A Creative Century. And you can see the facsimile page here in the Kerouac entry. And this catalog, I don't know if anyone knows this, was put together by none other than a young Andreas Brown, then a graduate student. And speaking of Brown, even though I have not had quite as much time as I would like to look through the boxes of correspondence in Penn's Gotham bookmark records, yesterday, I did find a very interesting letter by Andreas Brown to Stella Sampas, dated from, he's signing it at the bottom. I don't know if you can see, it says, the catalog compiled by Andreas Brown, and it's signed here. So I found a letter by Andreas Brown to Stella Sampas from July 1980. July 2nd, 1980. So right around the time the Kerouac Prospectus was made. And he writes, "Dear Mrs. Kerouac, As you may recall, I have written to you before about the possibility of publishing Jack's small pocket notebook now in the Humanities Research Center collection at the University of Texas. This year is Gotham Book Mart's 60th anniversary, and I would like very much to publish something in our Masters series. We began this series a few years ago with a previously unpublished story by Samuel Beckett, the Nobel Prize winner. We did a very handsome signed limited edition, which Mr. Beckett liked very much. While I was at the University of Texas on a graduate research fellowship, I compiled an important exhibit catalog, The Creative Century, for them, and included Jack's notebook as one of the major items. Ever since then, I've had a strong desire to see it reprinted in exact facsimile as a small spiral-bound pocket notebook. Jack wrote in a clear, legible hand, and it might be nice to consider doing a photographic copy of the pages just as he wrote it. However, if you feel that the manuscript needs any kind of editing, that could of course be done. It could easily be typeset. The notebook is titled Journal During the First Stages of On the Road. I would make a beautiful little book, and I would be proud to issue it as part of our anniversary celebration. As you probably know, Gotham Book Mart was Jack's bookshop in New York City, and we helped him from time to time in locating a book he wanted, placing his manuscripts and letters in university libraries, forwarding his mail, etc. I think it would be appropriate to publish something of Jack's on this occasion. It could be done either as a very limited edition or as an inexpensive publication on a large printing. I would be very happy to work out an advance and royalty agreement in any format you preferred. I would make every effort to make the book attractive and tasteful and would, of course, comply with any conditions you might wish to make. I look forward to hearing from you. Best wishes. So, even though this proposal is about the 1948 Roar Diary, right, the letter describes a project that's very close to that Haunted Life prospectus that we have, right, what it describes. It shows that Brown was very interested in having a Kerouac specialty item made in conjunction with the store's 60th anniversary. And perhaps that once the diary idea didn't work out, he eventually tried it with Haunted Life. As far as I've been able to find, there is no reply from Mrs. Kerouac, Stella Sampis, in the collection to this letter, nor is there any from Kerouac's literary agency, Sterling Lord. So we don't know if Stella ever replied to Brown. I believe it's logical to assume that there's a third person involved, someone else entirely who somehow had ownership of the Haunted Life manuscript since 1944 and who decided in 1980 to bring it to the Gotham. Perhaps this person was one of the Gotham's many regular patrons and had heard of Brown's desire to publish a Kerouac specialty facsimile edition in 1980, and they brought the manuscript over to the store, which would have surely excited Brown and moved him to make the prospectus that we do have. Brown would have known that he would need Stella Sampis's permission to go ahead, as the letter kind of shows here. And it's perhaps at this juncture, once the Sampises were alerted to the existence of the Haunted Life manuscript, that the Sampis family likely threatened legal action to both stop the facsimile project in its tracks and secure possession of the manuscript itself. Based on the available evidence I've been able to find so far, and of course there's more research to be done, but for now, and knowledge of how this Sampis family operated, I speculate that this is how the estate finally got hold of the manuscript, and they never publicly divulged this fact, which then later allows John Sampis to sell it on auction anonymously and pocket the profits. But without access to John Sampis's own papers, which may one day become available, we won't know exactly the when and the how the estate came to be in possession of the manuscript. Until then, we may never solve the mystery of who actually brought the manuscript to the Gotham Book Mart in 1980, and thus who had it in its possession since '44. We could stand here and speculate forever, but to do that, we'd have to have a haunted life. All right, thanks.
Brian, I was just wondering if Christie's has issued any kind of, pardon?
Is Christie's aware?
Yeah, if they're, well, I mean, they must be aware at this point if they changed the cataloging, and if,
Well,
or are they?
So actually, the June auction did not alert Christie's that they had screwed up. I alerted Christie's that they had screwed up. I emailed them some months ago and told them that I had discovered this in the midst of my catalog, in the midst of my research, and they responded very professionally. And again, I don't think there's any malfeasance in any of this. They said that their research was based on the best bibliography, and I think that that is to a large extent true. The bibliography on both the first and the subsequent printings of the Ditto edition is very bad. And I've got a whole nother lecture that's just on the 1956 edition. But yeah, they are aware now.
I mean, there's no recourse for the buyer of the 2013 buyer.
No
I'm
idea
sure
what they would do in that case.
Yeah,
You know, most auction terms of sale are quite onerous for the buyer, not for the seller, and you have very little recourse. It's basically a buyer beware situation, and you buy all goods as is, and all sales are final. And auction houses are very, very loath to take returns.
These are both such wonderful journeys, these talks and races, and exciting. And I wondered, though, if I could ask both of you to step back a little outside your amazing stories for a second, maybe put Paul back in the mix here and talk a little bit about Brown and maybe it's canon making, maybe it's fetishization of both things that are type-like, Brian, and things that are handwritten, author's hand. We can go back to that from this morning if we want to, but just Brown and Gotham in these stories that you've told, other, and these relationships of this sort of king making or whatever, power plays for a literary authority that you might say, if you agree, that are going on in the stories that you're telling. Just be interested in your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Well, just this week in my course, we were reading Stephen Ennis's In the Author's Hand essay from 2002, and he talks about that kind of thirst for origins and traces of life that emerges from these actual documents, and the importance of author authenticity, the conjoined roots of those terms and those concepts, and how archives can give us that kind of a zing. And that's why when we learn of any kind of deception or wrongdoing, it's perhaps even more painful that something has taken place like that. I mean, for me, some of my thinking with Kerouac, that's why I wanted to end on this rather, dark photo of him in profile where he just looks, so dejected and sad, in the sense of, one of his own creations being in existence out there, and someone knows that it's out there and he thinks it's lost, but it's not. And, that kind of pillaging or pilfering that can take place for profit for future generations. I mean, there's such a convoluted and complex history with literary heirs and how estates handle decisions, and the Kerouac case is a famous one, maybe not as infamous as the Joyce case or the Zhukovsky case, but it's present in the sense that there's been some mishandling of materials, and now we learn kind of layers of added deception that we had never even known about before. So I don't know.
I guess I as the bookseller, I guess I'd like to speak a little bit in favor of fetishization, actually. Yeah. First, what Brown is doing in both of these cases is actually taking part in a very long tradition of the relationship between booksellers and writers, which is the issuing of these limited editions, which appeal pretty much purely to collectors in order to pay the artists. Yes, there is certainly a fetish quality to that, but it's part of a larger ecosystem in which the artist is trying to make a living. No, I actually like it. For me, a lot of this material, you know, there's two ways that I think about this as a seller, and not just a seller, but a seller who really, in most cases, loves the material that I handle. Two things. One is, if there isn't a monetary impulse for a lot of this, stuff doesn't get saved, for better or worse. That if there isn't a monetary value for it, it is just that much more likely to end up in the dumpster. Now, I will also freely admit that that is a very self-serving argument for me to partake in, and I'm well aware of that. But I also believe that these objects, the books and the manuscripts and the typescripts, that as objects, as particular instantiations, they have stories to tell, not just textually, but physically. And therefore, because of that, really deserve to be saved and kept and passed on from generation to generation. And collectors and booksellers and libraries are all sort of part of this ecosystem that kind of helps shepherd this material from one generation to the next.
I guess I just push a little further and say, to what extent do you think Brown is helping to make that along with Ennis and a certain generation? And I mean, again, not necessarily an answerable question, but I think there's a possibly historical discussion there.
You know, I haven't done a lot of research on Brown, but I did spend a lot of time in his archive, and you know, I sort of know the general arc of his career. You know, I mean, he had a controversial and complicated career. And I think there are things that he did that were very important. I mean, his letters are, you know, I read a lot of his letters with Ginsberg, and he is acting very diligently to get Ginsberg money in many cases. And then 2 letters later in the same file, you see him putting off all sorts of other people who he owes money to, sometimes for months or years at a time. So those 2 things exist together. You know, I think it's a complicated legacy.
I guess I have a question for JC. This manuscript really strikes me, and you touched on it, on how it was sold in the catalog, how they remarked it was so clean, and yet we think it's the only one. And I'd like to just comment on how Peter Sallybrass loves to talk about the Ulysses manuscript at the Rosenbach because it's so clean. It's not a working copy, right?
Right.
So do you believe that there are possibly multiple copies of this?
Well, so Todd talks a bit about that in his introduction, but this is clearly a clean copy that he was making, and he was being very careful about it. So it's kind of like a final draft in a way, or handwritten final draft of Part 1, Home, of The Haunted Life. But we've never located any previous drafts of that particular story. The other ones that name, say, Peter Martin, the same character, were identified conclusively as being part of The Town and the City, which he starts really 2 years later, 1946, and finishes in 1948. So this is an earlier moment, and yeah, it's a clean copy in that sense, but and it's obvious, and there's almost no grammatical mistakes also, like as they mentioned in the catalog. So it's something that he had taken some time working on. So even, I mean, it says, you know, begun May 19th, 1944. I think he's like recording when he started writing it, but not when he was actually making this particular copy. So we don't know when actually it was created and made. That's why, you know, but all we know is that he thought it didn't exist anymore, right? Like he had lost it. So it's difficult to tell what exactly, you know, it's still a mystery.
Yeah, it's also interesting that there's an address on it. Was that later, or was that something that he knew he would want back?
That's what he, so that was Edie Parker's apartment, who was his girlfriend, then became his wife after the Kammerer death, the murder. And he wrote a ton of stuff there. So we know that was her address, and so he probably did that version somewhere there in 44, 45. Yeah, so it helps that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Great.
I have a question for Brian and one for JC. But Peter Howard, you know, told me that story about how he was going around getting the autographs, and he actually offered me a copy of it, which I was dumb enough not to buy. But do you think it's kind of interesting that Peter died in 2011, and the 2013 auction copy surfaced after his death, and there's no way Peter would have allowed that description to go forward. You know, with the and then
Could that have been Peter's copy?
no. I mean, he.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Right. That
Because
someone
Peter
would
always
acted-
described it as the way you described it. He wouldn't have pretended that it was a first edition.
No, absolutely not. That's interesting. That had Peter been alive, maybe that auction wouldn't have
Yeah.
happened. Possibly, yeah. You know, I mean, Peter was himself a very controversial figure.
Yeah.
But you know, one thing that I think he was you know pretty scrupulous. In fact, he made a lot of enemies enforcing his scrupulousness. So yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
And for JC, a couple weeks ago, I was looking at a book that you're probably familiar with, but it was about Kerouac piracies. And apparently, like, the first piracy occurred the day after his death. They mimeographed off some copies of the poem, which were then distributed for free at the Phoenix Bookshop. But they said there's like 62 piracies, and one of the reasons why is that the estate never responded to requests to publish in the early days. So they would just go ahead and publish things like that.
That's interesting to learn. I mean, I know they took a long time to kind of get. They put most of the stuff in a vault kind of early on in Lowell, but some of the stuff had been kind of copied already. I mean, Kerouac himself was kind of like a very fast typist, and he would often type a lot of his friends' things, and so some of these things were kind of circulating in other ways. Yeah, early on the policy was to not answer anything. Stella Sampras exerted almost the opposite, had a very opposite approach than her brother in terms of she closed things. She did not say yes. She did not give permission. And so she was really only concerned with Visions of Cody early on, and then not interested in most projects, whereas John had the complete polar opposite approach. Yeah.
One of the great piracies is there's a telephone book sized called the Uncollected Kerouac that was done in a Xeroxed edition. Well, actually, at least 2 Xeroxed editions. That itself, there are all sorts of apocryphal stories about that I've never been able to get straight. Ted Berrigan was involved. Ginsberg was involved at one point, and a number of other people. But it was created in no small part because of this, that there was a small circle of admirers who were feeling that there was a lot of this material that wasn't getting out, and the Uncollected Kerouac has like his high school writing, his, you know, a lot of his very early periodical appearances, stuff that just never got republished, and as far as I know to date still hasn't been.
Well, thank you to our speakers again. This is really wonderful.